Stepan, bandera, Stepan. Paćko naš bandera, Ukrajina mati, mi za Ukrajinu budemo vojuvati. Paćko naš bandera, Ukrajina mati, mi za Ukrajinu budemo vojuvati. Paćko naš bandera, bačko naš bandera, Ukrajini slava від Донецька місто Лева. Слава Україні, аж від Криму і до Сум. Пам'ять про Бандеру як героя, я тобі не
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Liz.
My name is Brace, and we, of course, joined by producer
Young Chomsky.
There he is, and this is TrueAnon. Hello.
Hello. How are you doing?
Good. Brace,
Yes.
what do you know about esoteric Hitlerism?
I'm more into mainstream Hitlerism, frankly.
Interesting.
Kind of taking a page from your book, but
Okay.
esoteric. Actually, I'll be honest. When we did the Spider Network episodes, I'd known about esoteric Hitlerism because it's just like around, but I never really read about it. I did read about it then, and it is just completely.
Wait, is it around? What do you mean it's around?
It's like around, you know what I mean? Like it's like people still. We talk about it in this episode. Like people still sort of like believe in it. But the problem is, and this is my struggle with a lot of like extreme right wing stuff. Is these guys write so much. It's like tweaker style, and
I do think that. I mean, a lot of them be tweaking.
I know, but it feels like I'm like entering into like lore for some like fucking fantasy like IP that I've never heard of before, and then I have to like kind of come in at the middle because it's like all these muddled sort of like, you know, Oriental, you know, mysticism ideas mixed with oftentimes like the person's own mental illness.
Nobody's got new ideas. Everything's just a hybrid.
I will say esoteric Hitlerism did seem kind of like I guess it was a hybrid, but nobody thought to combine Hitler with Hindu before then. You know?
Yeah.
But yeah, it was started by a woman, you know? Kind of your guys' thing.
Don't put it on me.
No?
Well, we are, like you said, talking a little bit about esoteric Hitlerism, but about a lot of other things.
We're talking about a lot of different kinds of Hitlerisms.
There's all different kinds, apparently.
We have every Hitlerism I think that there is. We have a black Hitler. We have many regular Hitlers. We have esoteric Hitlerism. We have kind of like
there's a liberal Hitlerism.
There's liberal Hitlerism. We have kind of like syncretic Hitlerism as well. It's like we're doing like left wing. So do you remember? What was his name? This was like one of my favorite guys. His name was Matthew something. But he was like a sort of pre-alt-right Nazi figure who is kind of like a portly, kind of fucked up looking guy.
It's not Matthew Heimbach, is it?
Yes, Matthew Heimbach. So Matthew Heimbach, who now has some like sort of 70s European style, like we're a Nazi group, but like left wing or whatever, you know, like they have like a hammer and sickle. I don't know. Who knows? Do you remember like the cuck like battle that he had?
No.
I
don't even know. I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't know about a lot of this stuff.
I mean,
it's a little like too online for me.
Yeah. Well, this happened in real life. But
well, everything online is also real life. But I just mean like it's all coming from so much of the internet that I'm not.
So this is from an
to.
SPLC article. TWP, which I think is Traditionalist Workers' Party chief Matthew Heimbach arrested for battery after affair with top spokesman's wife. And the strange incident began just after 1 a.m. Tuesday when Matt Parrott, 36, called police from a Walmart near his home. He fled to the Walmart with his stepdaughter after a violent confrontation with Heimbach. The stepdaughter told police that Heimbach and Parrott's wife, two Matthews, the stepdaughter told police that Heimbach and Parrott's wife had been having an affair for 3 months. Heimbach and Parrott's wife said the fling had ended. The stepdaughter and Parrott's wife tried to set up Heimbach to see if he would continue the affair after saying it was over. During the setup at Parrott's Paoli trailer home, Matthew Parrott and his stepdaughter waited outside, standing on a box and watching through a window, police said. A confrontation ensued between Heimbach and Matt Parrott. Parrott told police Heimbach twisted him down to the ground and then choked him out. He grabbed and injured my hand after I poked his chest and then choked me out with his arm, Parrott said in a handwritten statement to police. Then he chased me to my home and did it again. So, I guess in the report, all 4 people involved in the incident recorded their occupation as white nationalists. Oh. So, I guess, I mean, what happened here is this Heimbach had been fucking his friend's wife. He said it ended, and then the stepdaughter and the husband of the woman set him up and watched, and then the dad the dad or stepfather, whatever, got beat up by the guy who was fucking his wife. So this actually makes Heimbach look pretty, like he's the one who's indisputably in charge of this group.
This is why, our more vanguardist political movements in the U.S. today are going poly, because it's to mitigate the sort of...
You don't have to worry about all of these. Because you watch a bunch of Instagrams on decolonizing polyamory, which obviously I'm a big subscriber of, and then you realize that jealousy is just... You got to make a lot of videos. If you become polyamorous, you got to look at the camera and make videos and be like, I'm not jealous at all. I don't care. I think it's good. When hubby's having snugglies in the California King bed and I'm out here watching fucking The Pit, and, that to me is like a perfect
always
night.
in that California King, isn't it?
Always in the I want a California King so bad. I am the California
big.
King. I know, but I like it. I like to roll around on there. Put my shoes up.
What do we got today?
We are talking about the Order of the Nine Angles. We are talking about 764. We are talking about neo-Nazis in all over the world, in Russia, in Ukraine. We are talking about Terrorgram. We are talking about some pretty nasty stuff.
Yeah. And it's it's a bit of a doozy. So let's get to it.
Privit, pani tepanove, Slava Brace Belden, u podcast TrueAnon, and we would like to welcome to the show. I'm switching to English now, of course. We would like to welcome to the show Peter, who writes the Substack blog Events in Ukraine, and is also, I should add, a freelance journalist. That makes it sound like an advertisement. I guess I need to work on that a little bit more. It's early. It's just a little background here. It's early for us here, but Peter is in, so it's very late for him there. And so there's my brain isn't working very quickly at all. And I just got to say, Peter, thank you so much for joining us, even though it's 5 a.m. there.
I don't even know what time it is over here. Thanks a lot for having me over. I really appreciate it. Great to see you guys.
We have a lot to talk about today, and I think some of this might be of interest to our listeners that have been bugging us to do a 764 episode or an Order of the Nine Angles episode. This is kind of like one of those episodes, except I would say a little more Ukraine focused. And I think the first thing that we really want to start with here is a story that kind of flew under the radar. I mean, I think people read about it, and it was one of those things you read maybe the headline, and then you kind of just forgot about it because nothing really happened. But the story of a Wisconsin teenager, 17-year-old kid named Nikita Nazarov, who murdered his parents. And I think this is the reason it was really big national news, was maybe planning on killing the president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. So you've written about this guy. What's his deal?
Well, I mean, as far as I could tell, there's very little known about this guy. He was a young man. And I mean, because sometimes when you look at this story, it seems like nothing happened. But I mean, he did kill his parents. That must have been pretty bad for them and for everyone involved. So he was definitely capable of some things, at least. And even though, there is some sort of pattern, I suppose. There was that other attempt on Trump's life during the elections, right?
Yes. Well, there was the two attempts on Trump's life. One of which I should add, we still know basically nothing about, and the other of which I would say comes from a different angle of maybe Ukraine supporter. I think is a way to term it. I'm not so sure that necessarily Nikita's in the same boat here. Who seems to have just been kind of maybe extremely bipolar.
It's also difficult to call that one an attempt.
Yeah. Well, he was in the bushes.
I think he was there for
attempted
5
an
hours
attempt
or something.
Yeah, it's a long time to sit in the bushes.
Yeah. And the guy that shot Trump's ear, he sort of looked a bit similar to this Kasab guy, quite a sort of, basement dweller type of physiognomy.
Ugly.
Yeah. He was also killed instantly by the there was that whole thing where he was somehow able to sort of gather with his gun and then shoot, as I understand, in this event that was, meant to be or was guarded or monitored by whatever the American secret forces is that
Secret Services,
that's right. But then he was able to sort of set up, and there were videos of him setting up as well, and people saw him setting up, and he shot and supposedly, I guess did, right? Shoot Trump's ear, and also kill someone in the crowd or something.
He shot a firefighter.
Yeah, and someone got killed there, but then he got killed instantly after, which was interesting. But then with Kasab, he got arrested. And the main reason why, I wrote about it, and, the sort of interesting aspect of it was that the FBI had this whole affidavit, or whatever it's called, I think it's an affidavit that it released online, which involved his basically his online messages, and he'd spent a lot of time on Telegram, the messaging app, which is very popular among these. I think beyond the whole Ukraine, Russia links, whatever, because it did claim that he was in contact with a Russian-speaking person in Ukraine. Beyond this, maybe that was not true, whatever. I think it can be sort of fairly reasonably stated that this was a deranged person, right? He killed his parents. And there are lots of communities for these deranged people on Telegram that are sort of interested in these ideas of right-wing accelerationism. And he was, according to the FBI affidavit, he was interested in these right-wing accelerationist ideas that we need to bring about kind of chaos to destroy the government. And then we can have, because apparently, he talked in these messages how we can't elect Hitler. It's not possible. So we need to
Which is weird because they did elect Hitler the first time.
Apparently no longer possible. Apparently in the current age, the liberals have reached this.
So he's an ultra rightist. He's like electoralism is no longer an option.
Exactly. And so they think that it's necessary to accelerate the decay of Western liberal civilization by acts of mass violence and school shootings and so on. Anyway, if you kill your parents, I'm sure you're into these sort of things. And there are real communities of these people on Telegram. It's a place where there's not much censorship and so on and so on. There's this whole phenomenon of terrorgram, which
I think that's how people might know it, because it's always referred in the U.S., at least in the news, as terrorgram, as like this kind of constellation of all these different channels or Discord, even including Discords and different chat groups, where there's a kind of just like new online communities where they're all sharing all these different manifestos and kill the Jews. That's what I imagine. Lots of knife emojis. I don't really know what goes on there.
It's some of it. It's interesting because I've looked at some of it. In fact, because we were going to do this episode a couple of weeks ago before we just rescheduled it or whatever. But I had started looking at some of this stuff, and I'd read about it. And it's really like rotten.com. Some of it's like rotten.com taken to like 1,000. Or Rate My Poo taken to 1,000.
Excuse me?
Rate My Poo was a website that I looked at when I was in middle school. It was sort of a healthier alternative to rotten.com, and you rated poo. But it was the first website I ever saw. Anyways, but so some of them have like, yes, like this sort of like extreme gore, sometimes war footage. And then there's a lot of, and I didn't see any of this stuff, child sex exploitation material. There's a lot of things that are sort of a mixture between child sex exploitation and violence. There's a lot of extortion and blackmailing on young kids that these people meet on Roblox and Minecraft, etc., Discord, and then they post the videos of the things they get these kids to do in the fucking chats. And then there's a sort of like worship of like Anders Breivik or Brandon Tarrant and like these mass shooters. And sometimes that's in a very political way. And then sometimes, and I think this is almost becoming more common, it's just in a straight up nihilistic way without really any pretenses of like politics. And I was looking through the affidavit about Nikita Nazarov, and the FBI is saying, he killed his parents, right? And he like sits in the house with them for about 12 days, and he's like messaging his boys on these chats on Telegram, who they're saying that the government's saying are Russian speaking or whatever, based in somewhere in Eastern Europe. And they're like giving him advice on how to basically hide his parents' bodies, which by the way was bad advice, because the advice was put blankets over them. Well, I'm sorry. When the police come to your house and they see these bundles of blankets on the floor and they're like, we're looking for the possible dead bodies of people, they're going to lift the blanket.
Maybe he meant to like hide it from you. Like,
yeah, you don't got to see it.
Peekaboo.
But it seems pretty clear, Peter, that he was like kind of enmeshed in this world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's an important point what you said about how they're not really political. I mean, if you look at the sort of this, because there's this other network that we'll probably be mentioning, like the 764, which is particularly focused on exploiting, manipulating teens, young people on the internet. Often sort of they'll go to it's very depressing. I mean, it's kind of sad because what's happening now is that it's kind of like, it's kind of being framed in this satanic panic thing. And it's sort of sometimes there's this feeling that it's easy. Maybe this is just kind of a right-wing hysteria, it doesn't exist. But I mean, it does exist. It is kind of depressing, because they go on these subreddits for, teens that self-harm, right? And there's subreddits for these teens that self-harm where they kind of support each other without being judgmental, I suppose. And then these 764 people will go on there and sort of encourage them to cut more, which is also like it's hard to sort of distinguish sometimes who's real, who's not. But then they encourage people to kill themselves or to cut really, all kinds of really awful things, and also like money extortion. They get, and then they'll get sort of nude photos of these children and they'll extort them for money or just to kill themselves. But it's very nihilistic. Like, I mean, it's not, the point is just for, this gore type of thing of this nihilistic killing themselves, killing their pets. That's another thing, or like their family members and so on. But I mean, it's not really ideologically. I mean, they like Hitler, but they like Hitler as someone who did bad things, who was like a crazy motherfucker, But if you look at, there was this big 764 case in the U.S. They arrested this guy, and he was like, I mean, not to be, racial or whatever, but he was Mexican. He was very brown, right? Like there were a fair few articles about this guy, and he was very into Hitler and whatever. And there was also this recent shooting in the U.S. by this black guy as well, and he was also
Solomon. That's
right, yeah. And he was also in this community, and he sort of professed to be like anti-black. Anyway, I mean, what I'm saying is,
there was. Yeah. I should add, there was 2 school shootings. Mm-hmm. There was Solomon, and then there was another 15-year-old girl who shot up her school. I can't remember if it was in Wisconsin. It was somewhere in the Midwest. And it turns out that they had known each other, but they did very similar sort of like, there's these kind of tells these people have. It's weird. A lot of it seems like almost Xerox copies of the mass shootings that they kind of worship or like get into these
or like
cults
reenactments.
Around. Exactly. And so like they'll do the thing where they do like the OK symbol, which is, throwback to 2017 or whatever. They do the OK symbol and like take a picture of them sitting in a bathroom stall, I guess getting ready to go do the mass shooting with like a combat boots on and like the OK symbol. And I thought it was very interesting that like the two people that did these mass shootings don't really fit the profile of what you might think of people sort of being connected to these transnational sort of online Nazi, I guess, as shorthand, but really just like nihilistic violence groups, because one was, like a young black kid, and then the other was a young white girl. And those generally are not, I mean, you think of somebody more who looks like maybe Thomas Crooks doing something like this.
Yeah, I mean, there was also a case, like there was a school shooting in Russia in 2024 that I wrote about as well. And it was committed by a young girl, a 14-year-old girl. And it was the first. I mean, there aren't that many mass shootings in general in Russia until kind of recently. And obviously none were by a woman. So this was also a first. But yeah, I mean, I guess the whole kind of the difficulty of talking about this sort of things, right, is with school shootings and so on, is you don't want to sound too crazy, right? Because it's kind of easy to sort of start sounding really crazy. But on the other hand, these are real things that are happening, right? I mean, in sort of the societies that we live in and around the world. And these people do, like, this, obviously, it's not sort of some kind of debated fact. I mean, they are, how do I call it, like radicalized, whatever, in these online communities. So it makes sense to look at these online communities, because ultimately, I mean, if you're a sad kid at school, it's not really a logical next step to start killing other people. Like, that's not really something that is the logical next step. It really does take being online and, I mean, being told that by other people that seem to be, I mean, often they're sort of, one interesting thing is they often kind of idolize the leaders of these groups. I mean, there's like this fairly ridiculous, but seemingly real, at least at some point in the past few years, the maniac murderers cult. And I mean, when you look at the testimony of people that were kind of involved in this, they often sort of say that they were, including like young women, for instance, that they really idolized the leader of this group, who told them to like commit school shootings or whatever. And he was kind of this young man who had lots of selfies and kind of looked a little bit like, I don't know, like a Nazi little peep sort of thing, lots of face tattoos and so on. And that's really
a Nazi little peep.
I mean, I don't know. I guess
that's really kind of the look.
There's it's kind of a look, but also I remember the guy from Red Guards Austin kind of looked like, I'm going to say Nazi little peep, but he looked like, also had a kind of little peep thing going on there.
He had a crazy background.
It's Lil
as well.
Pepe instead of Lil Peep.
Yeah, I think a lot of, I mean, I got friends with face tattoos, obviously mostly MS-13, so it's just for work, but like, it's one of those things where it's like, if the guy is like leading your political movement, has a lot of face tattoos, I'm like, well, maybe.
True, but I mean, I was just more making the point that like Lil Peep, SoundCloud rappers, all that sort of stuff, it's really, really popular in Russia, in Ukraine, like the kids love it. So, I mean, it's just kind of a sexy thing and the kids love it. So, I mean, I was just kind of saying in the sense that to start killing your peers, you sort of need to have a voice of authority sort of encouraging you in some sense to do this. Like, you don't really get this idea by yourself. And even if this idea came to you, it would sort of, in terms of the commitment required to do that anyway. So like, I mean, it does kind of make sense to try and figure out where this comes from, because it really, it doesn't really require believing that, maybe it's some, government intelligence service telling people to do this. Like, maybe not, or maybe, but I mean, someone at least is definitely encouraging kids to do this. And maybe it's just a random group of, weird people on the internet. Maybe whatever else. But like, I guess that's the grounding assumption, but it's kind of a logical assumption to make, I guess, from moving, that we can continue our discussion from that, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think that leads us pretty neatly into another character we sort of have to talk about, which would be Joshua Sutter, who I thought we had talked about on this show because I had a bunch of notes on him, but I don't know if they're connected to actually any episode that we did. The journalist Allie Winston has done a lot on Sutter, and actually a lot on all of this. I really like his work, but Joshua Caleb Sutter is an interesting character who sort of provides a bit of connective tissue for some of this stuff. He is a Satanist neo-Nazi who was actually formerly, and I actually got really I looked at this for way too long, I think he was formerly Hindu. I can't remember exactly which. He subscribed to some Eastern religion. I'm sure it was like fucking whatever that Nazi esoteric Hitlerism or whatever. I'm sure he did Hinduism in a scary way. But he was previously, some kind of Eastern religionist, and also involved in a pro-Juche, like North Korean party here that seemed to be made up of him and a few other sort of mentally ill people who sort of.
Sorry, are you telling me that that's not a large party here?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've mentioned this on the show before. I mean, it does have some purchased in Nepal, for instance, where the only non-North Korean Juche party actually governs a relative to Nepal size, sort of mid-sized city there. Which is but that says more about Nepal's sort of political scene, which is, I think, fascinating. But this guy, Joshua Caleb Sutter, was sort of involved in these kind of, I guess, esoteric movements in general. I think it's fair to say that like a Juche, American Juche party, even among like, sort of oftentimes these very highly hyphenated communist parties in America, is fairly esoteric, and became a neo-Nazi white power Satanist FBI informant.
Yeah. And I mean, it is worth mentioning.
But I repeat myself.
It is worth mentioning that the FBI informant, it's not something, that's speculated upon. I mean, this was proven by a, U.S. court hearing, right? Like, because there was this event. I mean, Rolling Stone has this big article about it and so on. And there are lots of places you can read about it, where basically I think it was 2022. It was quite recently. I mean, Sutter has been a neo-Nazi freak for a long, long time, like 20, 25 years or so. But in 2022, there was this American military serviceman who was really into these Telegram communities of these Sutter's communities and so on, and these different right-wing accelerationist groups. And he was being deployed to Turkey, and he was arrested not in Turkey, but in, I can't remember where, but like, I think Greece or something, whatever. Mm-hmm. But like on his way to Turkey, because he was planning to commit some kind of mass shooting event at the military base in Turkey, and he hoped this would draw the U.S. into a new Middle Eastern war, and this would like lead to the disintegration of the world and so on. But and then at the trial of this guy, it was revealed that Martinet Press, which is the neo-Nazi right-wing accelerationist publication that Sutter has run for the past 20, 25 years. And Sutter himself, Sutter is an FBI informant, and he's received over $140,000 US over the years from the FBI. And I mean, and another thing that I kind of found out somewhat recently about, I actually knew this for a while, but I didn't really put the dots together. I thought like, that would be too in your face. But I mean, Sutter, before Martinet Press, he had Angleton Imprints. But this was literally named, and it had the face of James Jesus Angleton on it. Like it wasn't. So I mean, they're often quite, So James Angleton, he was it was like not the CIA, or was it the CIA? I don't know.
It was the CIA. Yeah,
he was like
the gaunt figure who went crazy in the wilderness of mirrors. I think he has a bit of like. I think he strikes sort of a melancholic and romantic figure to some people. And so maybe that's why they chose it. I don't know. Or maybe
they often really enjoy playing with this. Like if you go on the different right-wing accelerationist communities, which is like, not a great way to spend time, but like they often have nicknames or usernames like MK Ultra, they're really into this type of thing. And I think that for them, there's other things we can talk about. Often they'll say in interviews as well, I wish I was an FBI informant. There's one guy in the Temple of Blood, I forget his name. This is one of Sutter's main organizations. And he's said in interviews that I wish I was. People often accuse me of being I think this is actually the Adam Waffen guy. Anyway, all these organizations are also kind of stupid and intertwined. But in this interview, he said, I'm often accused of being an FBI agent. I wish I was an FBI agent. That would be great. And he repeats that many times. But obviously, in the world of these kind of right-wing militia groups in the US, like in any other country, they're very, very infiltrated by the intelligence services. I think partly because they're so open about being like, murderous forces of chaos, which would obviously attract attention from any law enforcement agencies, but also because they're all pretty stupid, pretty crazy, and they're all kind of into drugs and into all kinds of other very bad things. And they have different, they already have criminal records and so on. But it is obviously noteworthy that Sutter, I think at this point probably we can mention that Sutter, from the early 2000s with Martinet Press and Angleton Imprints and so on, he aligned himself with this ideological tradition of the Order of the Nine Angles, which is this kind of Satanist ideology created in the sort of late 1980s. It claims to be sort of eternal. It claims that it's existed forever in the British sort of boglands, but whatever. But I mean, basically, it emerged in the 1980s. And it's not really worth going into this whole weird history of it. It's like complex and strange, but it
involves a guy. I think one of its main guys, I think, trying to join Al Qaeda at one point.
Yeah, I mean, because this is the whole thing. Like with the Juche thing, they have this idea of inside roles where it's like you need to join different. You can't just be a weird Satanist. You need to sort of pretend to be normal, and you also need to pretend to have other different identities, especially radical, extreme identities. So it could be an extreme, even a extreme left-wing person, also religious Christian or extreme Islamist, and so on. And then you can learn things from that. And but then this can they have all these different levels of leveling up. Anyway, they have this whole but Order of Nine Angles. They're Satanists, but they think the other Satanists are stupid and sort of posers. They're also the original Order of Nine Angels is very like intellectualist and very, very sort of like pretentious to read.
It seems like it came out of that like whole sort of almost like adjacent to psychic TV kind of scene. And maybe I'm reading too much into that because that was such a big thing in the UK in the 1980s, this like kind of like arts house, like, sort of fake snuff film. I'm weird. I'm fucked up. And also because I say that because psychic TV had Temple of Psychic Youth, I think, or whatever it was, but they spell the "of" in the same way, which I'm sure is some old Satanist thing. Blah 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 blah.
It was also really trendy for a while.
That's basically what I'm saying. Like it was trendy, you know what I mean? Yeah. And so like it seems like Satanism has always been so difficult for me to take seriously because most of the
I really don't think you need to explain.
I don't think I really need to. Well, no, because Liz, I'm becoming more informed about the other worlds out there of the God and the devil and things like that. But I'm like, dude, Satanism seems like a really bad bargain. If you're going to become a Christian, you get to go to heaven. If you become a Satanist, you are definitely going to hell, but you'll have a good time there. It seems crazy to me, but it's tough to take Satanism seriously because so much of it is like, first of all, you basically think you're doing magic, which is okay, fair, true for a lot of religions as well. But like, it's like literally sometimes they're like, we're doing spells and stuff like that. And I'm like, no, you're not.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I should sort of, there's lots of the sort of information about the Order of Nine Angels. The Order of Nine Angles. There's this podcast, the Empire Never Ended. They did lots of interesting stuff about that. And I really can't say that I have better expertise than them on Order of Nine Angles. I understand the Ukrainian-Russian thing a bit better, but in terms of Order of Nine Angles, from what I could gather from sort of listening to them and reading about them, and they did come out of the UK, hardcore neo-Nazi, street militia scene. But then, obviously the sort of the leader and this guy, David Mayat, who knows what his real name was, all these different whatever, who cares? And he had different identities, whatever. But, you read things that were probably written by him and it's very, very pretentious. Like, I might read this one thing where it's him with his girlfriend and he was really into like drawing paintings with a period blood. And they're really into like woman in this, they have this idea of this, woman sorcerer thing. And they think that's really cool. Anyway, that's the sort of, whatever, but like, that's the Order of Nine Angles. And I actually, weirdly, I know people that are sort of into this. It's the whole Wiccan type of thing, but it's for like smarter people, I think, who think that they're like, smarter.
People who think they're smarter.
And it's like, and like, it does always seem like just a little like subculture to me. You know what I mean? Like I looked at some of Martinet Press's books because they're on Amazon. I didn't look them on there. They're on, I think, Internet Archive too. And I was like, oh, these are kind of like zines. Like you guys are doing like I'm a weird guy zine.
But I will like just say that Martinet Press, like that's the whole Sutter thing, and that is like, you know, I mean, as I understand, I mean, not as I understand, it's a fact. I mean, the Order of Nine Angles, all that stuff, they're also totally crazy, and they have all kinds of, you know, pedophilia, whatever sort of thing. Yeah. But I mean, Caleb Sutter and Martinet Press, they really took it to a whole new level in terms of the pedophilia thing, the murdering children thing. That's kind of what these novels are about. I mean, it's not kind of, it's explicitly what they're about, especially just like, you know, killing, sexually assaulting in very like, you know, crazy ways, children and all kinds of people. They're really into this. And their books, I mean, it's kind of, they are like zines, but they're intended to be read. And I mean, there's this really crazy line where it's like, what's it, like human IEDs? That's one line that's used. I think it was from the, there was like, I think, is this the journalist you mentioned, Nate Thayer? But this is just from the Rolling Stone article about the whole Caleb Sutter thing. And they were saying how these books that Sutter wrote or published through his Martinet Press, it's like the equivalent of creating human IEDs, people who are wired for violence and disconnected enough from morality that they have no compunction about abuse, torture, pedophilia, and the other practices. I mean, that is like, I mean, I haven't really read these things beyond some sort of extracts. I kind of don't really care enough.
I think the thing that I looked at, because they have the novels, they put out novels, but then they also have, I guess these kind of zines, I guess it was about like a bunch of different people. They kind of remind me of those, what do they call, like, I think it's called like Apocalypse Confidential or something like that. Or like, they're just like, there was so much of this shit in the 1990s of people like basically making like compilation zines of like all your craziest stuff. I remember reading when I was younger, there was one, you know, because this stuff was like floating around kind of the punk scene. Not this stuff, but like, you know, whatever, like the Jim Goad kind of shit. Like an interview with a lady who was a mortician who made love to the corpses in her care. And it was like, you know, sort of presented as a straight interview. And I remember reading it and being like, wow, people sure are crazy. I guess this sort of seems of a piece with that, but like obviously to a much greater level. And then it seems like, you know, like Sutter is clearly a fucking freak on a level like that is difficult for, I don't know necessarily if I've met a person like this before in my life. I sure hope I have not.
But Sutter was really active in promoting 764, right? Like that's my understanding, is that was like one of the big focuses of the last few years.
As I understand, he has been. And I guess with 764, it's this weird thing because it's not an organization, right? It's kind of like a lot of these things. I mean, you know, with the Order of Nine Angles, for instance, it's the same thing. It's not an organization. Like there's no leader, right? I mean, there was this guy that sort of may have written the texts and whatever, but who knows? But it's not an organization. They have different like nexions, which are cells, and you can set up your own nexion. You know, it's kind of like, I mean, from what I understand, from what I have some friends that are really into researching ISIS and stuff, and it's kind of similar where you can just sort of call yourself ISIS and you're ISIS, but or Al Qaeda, as I don't know. I'm not going to say too much about that stuff, but with this thing, it is definitely the case. I mean, there are different experts. Like there's like what's it, like G Tech or something. Like there's this whole extremism research company that does reports about 764, and they've come out in the past 2 or 3 years, and they don't know if, I mean, with 764, it doesn't seem like there's any leadership at all. It's just basically different online communities that share. And 764, it comes from the postal code of, I think, this original guy, area code. That's right, in the US, that was really into this thing of blackmailing kids and getting them to kill themselves or whatever, and making money off it and so on. And so it's
interesting. I should mention too that sorry to interrupt, but there is a crossover here with kind of some of the stuff we were talking about for people who listen to our Zort series with UG Nazi and kind of what's termed the community or the comm, which is these like kind of like online sort of hacker groups who oftentimes are like engaged in like really nihilistic, just swatting whoever and fucking stealing shit from people, blackmailing people. there's pretty heavy overlap now, especially between obviously now, especially because 764 is much newer, but like a lot of these are like kind of the same kind of people. And I think you get a pretty good look into the kind of person who's into this with, and we talked about in the second episode, this guy, Mir Islam, who is just like this guy who's in his room all the time, completely hateful, also clearly has some kind of like mental disorders, and just spends his time grooming people he meets on video game, or like on online video games, and stalking and sending death threats and, swatting and hacking into people.
Yeah. I think with the calm, I know that there is like a section of that is 764. I'm sort of less. The calm kind of makes less sense to me than the 764, but there's definitely serious overlap. I mean, there was that thing as well. Where there was the because the calm, as I understand, it's more focused about hacking in general.
Yeah,
and there was that thing with the Doge guy, who was a calm guy. I mean, I'm sure you guys remember that, and he was in the calm. And then there was sort of people were arguing, like, was he in 764? I mean, as I understand, there was no evidence that he was in the 764. I mean, if he was 764, that'd be pretty. I feel like that'd be a pretty career ending, even for Doge. Because I mean, you can sort of make the argument that the calm, they're just hackers, and hackers can be cool as well, and they're useful because we need hackers to defend ourselves from other hackers and so on, or whatever. Mm-hmm. But yeah, with Sutter and 764, I can't actually really remember if he's explicitly supported 764. I think that there are definitely 09A people that have supported 764. And I mean, more importantly, I guess 764 itself is very, very into 09A ideology. And it's kind of the thing where it's like, it's not really a thing of organizations commanding each other, but it's just so like, decentralized. And people like the 764 communities, they're super into 09A ideology. And I mean, I guess at this point, we could also mention the idea of 09A ideology, which is that it's similar to sort of the classic right-wing militia type stuff like Siege, all this sort of thing. And they're also into the Siege thing. They kind of overlap there. But this idea of, we need to have a racial holy war, Rehowa. Rehowa, that's right. And because, reformism is at a deadlock or whatever, we can't elect Hitler, it's not going to happen. And so we need to, through different terrorist actions, we need to, incite a race war. And I think like, but I guess with them, it's not even that racial anymore, like with 09A and stuff. And so, because I think originally with, the sort of 20th century American, neo-Nazi militias, it was more like, bombing some kind of, maybe bombing like a black church or something, or I think, I mean, because I guess like the whole thing with these right-wing, really extreme right-wing people is they get very like black-pilled about white people as well, because they start saying, well, look, white people are not rising up for the white revolution, and we need to sort of shock them out of their laziness by also committing just general acts of terrorism that will cause people to lose faith in the government. And then there's going to be, civil war. And then we can, and then as I recall, like Adam Waffen, who's this another American contemporary, 09A Sutter adjacent group. They believe that they can then create like a white ethno-state out of part of the USA, and they have analogs with the Yugoslav wars, whatever, all kinds of things.
And it's I'm actually, it's coming back to me now. I realized the reason I think I was looking into Sutter stuff is because we did an episode on infrastructure attacks, and so the links that some of those had to Adam Waffen and sort of these siege type organizations. So a little bit of background for those who don't remember Adam Waffen being pretty prominently in the news in like 2017, 2018. They were like a neo-Nazi group, but it wasn't like Richard Spencer. They thought Richard Spencer was like, they thought he was like a liberal cuck, which I guess he did become. But like, they thought he was a liberal cuck back then. They were like much more into like just literally doing like, exactly what you described me, terroristic violence to sort of shock people awake. It's based around this guy, James Mason, who wrote this I think a series of books maybe called Siege, but it's all collected into one big volume, which I have read a lot of, and it is very stupid. But it's definitely, it's kind of I'm not going to say it's a far cry, but it's pretty different from like the American Nazi Party or like any of these like 60s, 70s organizations that were much more like, they had the uniforms and they'd try to like make, contacts to the Nation of Islam, all this kind of shit, like back Lincoln Rockwell kind of shit. These guys are much more, kind of in the vein of, I guess, lone wolf bombings and school shootings and things like that. And they would gather together in like these little nucleuses. There was one, of course, called the Base, whose leader, I believe, actually was a former, what was he, like a PMC guy, maybe like
he was in the State Department,
CIA or State Department.
He like worked with the State Department. It was crazy.
But now lives at now he was a contractor. That's what it was. Now lives in Russia. Yeah. But there was like a lot of these kind of groups floating around, and they got pretty prominent online through these sort of like edits that they would do. A lot of those like sort of, I guess, vaporwave edits with like the black sun circling around.
Fan cams.
Yeah, fan cams that they would do actually kind of come from this kind of Nazi guy. Funnily enough, one of remember that guy who got fired from the Ron DeSantis campaign for doing a Ron DeSantis vaporwave black sun Nazi supercut fan cam? That was amazing. But it's interesting to see how this stuff evolves because, you mentioned that one of the guys who got picked up for this stuff was Mexican. Well, actually, a lot of the guys who've been kind of getting picked up for this stuff have been BIPOC, including, I think, maybe an Indian guy somewhere in America. And I think that just goes to show that, like, actually, a lot of the Nazi stuff, this is some weird, I guess it's just the times we're living in. There's sort of like a joke about, like a Nick Fuentes fans kind of all being just like Mexican teenagers. But I really do think that like Nazism in America is about as multiculturalism as a political movement as one can get now, because a lot of people are just sort of in these weird online isolated communities, or they're isolated in their real life and they're on these online communities and these Discord groups, and you kind of inhabit this role of like, maybe it's masculine, I don't know what it is, but it's and it's also very nihilistic. And I think actually like Solomon, that the black teenager who shot up his school, I read his manifesto. It was called the N-word cell. Well, I didn't use N-word, but we did use the N-word, but N-word cell manifesto. And I read through it, and it's pretty schizophrenic, but like there's a lot of sort of like signals from these kind of online Nazi communities that are incorporated into this. And so it's almost like we're getting this stuff, which is Siege, which is kind of like a Xerox of like the Order stuff from like 1970s, 1980s. And then this new thing, like 764, kind of the 09A stuff, is almost like a Xerox of the Siege Waffen stuff. Because Waffen, very famously, one of their big blowups was 4 of them lived in this house in Florida. One of them converted to an extreme form of Islam and declared he was an ISIS, and then killed his roommates for not respecting his newfound religious beliefs. And then the roommate who wasn't home got arrested in a smoke shop because when the police raided the home, they found some radioactive material or something. Anyways, that's all to say. Things are getting very strange now.
Very strange. And I also I'm so sorry. I also wanted to apologize that, Liz, you're right. I mean, Sutter did promote at 764 explicitly. I just found like it was in the Wired articles on it and stuff that he was explicitly promoting it. I didn't want to defame Sutter. I would not want to be doing anything that's not stated in reputable publications. But yeah.
Well, I want to ask about Sutter, because Sutter he's kind of what you might call an unk figure, an old head in the online Nazi community and in the real life Nazi community. And something that has unfortunately torn this community apart. Sorry, this is hard for me. Something that's torn this community apart is the war in Russia and Ukraine, because we said no more brother wars, and then guess what they did? Zog made Putin and Zoglensky do a brother war. And there has been sort of like this weird, the international Nazi community has reacted, I would say, both well and poorly to this war, because on the one hand, you have our Aryan goats, well, maybe Slavic, but Aryan Slavic goats in Azov, and then you have Putin, who I would say like there's some of the more moderate Nazis would support, and there we got our guys on both sides here, and I think it's been tough. Sutter, though, seems like he has made his choice.
Yeah, I mean, Sutter is definitely team Ukraine, and I mean, this is because he has institutional sort of ties with the Ukrainian Azov movement, and there was one, for instance, there was a conference that the Azov movement conducted in Ukraine. 2018, so the pact of, I might be confusing the conferences here, but anyway, there was definitely the 2018 conference. It's on YouTube. You can see it. I have in my articles a link to it, where Sutter came with Waffen guys as well. And it was quite a small conference of just these right wing. Well, right wing is kind of an understatement, I think, for these guys, but like the friends of Azov. And he came there. So he's definitely tied with them. In terms of like the right wing split, I guess it is also, relevant, because I think right now we'll be transitioning into the Russia-Ukraine aspect of it. So yeah, like in terms of the neo-Nazi movement in the post-Soviet world, excluding Germany, which was not actually a Soviet state, to be clear.
Yeah.
And
Eastern Bloc.
Eastern Bloc. But I guess I'm not so sure about the rest of the Eastern Bloc. I think they probably had lots of, Hungary and Poland. They had plenty of skinhead and so on. I know less about those countries. But in terms of the Soviet Union, like Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, all these things, Kazakhstan, whatever. It was the neo-Nazi movement became really big in Russia in the late 90s and 2000s. And the reason why it was so big there was because, largely because of the huge labor migration to Russia, where you had a lot of mainly like Muslim people from the Caucasus region, and also like the Central Asian republics working in Russia. Many of them had been there before already, and but many more came as well in the 90s. And then this was also obviously a period of like incredible economic immiseration of all the citizens of the Soviet Union. But the Ukraine wasn't where lots of the labor migrants were going. And there were also a fair few in Ukraine, and there still are, but much less so than Russia. And then you had this very large, it was probably like the most neo-Nazis in the world were probably in Russia in the 2000s. There's different estimates how many there were, in sort of neo-Nazi skinhead organizations. It was definitely in the tens of thousands. I know someone that used to sort of be in this movement, and he sort of estimated that like 100,000 in the 2000s. And they were, and
there's some overlap too with like hooligans and like soccer.
Yeah, no, it's very, very much like a football hooligan thing. The most sort of aggressive and active of them, they were also football hooligans from different, and in basically all of the different like hooligan groups in Russia were like hardcore neo-Nazis, and the same in Ukraine is today the case. There was one that was kind of like an anti-fascist one, but then it also became quite right-wing, and so became really irrelevant as well. But so it's a little bit different. I think in other countries there's more of a stronger like Antifa football hooligan scene. In Russia and Ukraine it was less so. An Antifa scene did emerge in response to the Nazi scene in the 2000s. But it is worth making just noting that this was very, very murderous. Like these people were killing sort of hundreds of Muslim labor migrants, not only Muslim, but mainly Muslim in the 2000s. And there's different estimates how many, but definitely like hundreds at certain points within in 1 year it could be. So very, very murderous. It's interesting looking at the sort of causes for it. There was a lot of anti-migrant sentiment in society in general. There are also different economic things, like different criminal, but also small business competing over these markets.
It's interesting because the football hooligans in general, in certain countries and a lot of countries can like serve as muscle for either criminal or economic criminal kind of groups. And as I'm sure most listeners of this show will know, the 90s in Russia were tough. Things were tough over there. And
the 2000s.
In the 2000s, yeah. And so, yeah, there's this it's kind of overlap with organized crime as well.
Exactly. And I mean, and then in Ukraine, and then I guess the reason I bring this up with the whole Russia thing is because then, I mean, in the 2000s, you have this more as well, like, ideological, post-Soviet, right-wing neo-Nazi scene. And but at this point, there was really there was no difference between the Russian and the Ukrainian scene. They were very, very closely, they were very, very close friends. And then there's kind of famous, there were conferences in the 2000s, even really as late as I think 2011, 2012 or something, where there were conferences with Dugin, who is today, he's this right-wing Russian philosopher and so on, who is today obviously a very strong supporter of the Russian government. And his daughter was killed by a Ukrainian covert explosion operation, whatever. But then back in the 2000s, he was very close with these Ukrainian neo-Nazis who are now the Azovv battalion. I mean, Dugin as well had at various sort of points in which he was very sort of praising of different historical neo-Nazis and so on. And but I mean, they had a lot of overlap in terms of, I guess, just, right-wing mysticism, all that sort of thing. And generally pan-Slavism as well, and this idea of the, obviously the white Slavs against the non-whites and so on. But what then started happening was that, I mean, the peak of the right-wing violence in Russia was in the 2007, 2008, and then Russian law enforcement did start cracking down on it because it was getting very much out of hand, in terms of just killing people and so on, right? And they're doing all kinds of crazy things, like uploading decapitation videos to online communities. One guy who was most likely involved in this very famous decapitation video, he then came to Ukraine, and he's a prominent figure in the Azovv movement now. His name is Sergei Korotkych, or Boatswain, or whatever. And he was kind of involved in this very famous decapitation video of these two Muslim migrants. It was in 2006 or so. But what happened is they began being cracked down on by the Russian government. There was also sort of an attempt to sort of integrate them, obviously, in Russia, like in kind of most countries, the government tries to sort of channel opposition and opposition groups and to sort of use them in its own ways. And there were sort of attempts to sort of mainstream some of these figures. One of them was this very famous person, Maxim Martinkevich, Tesak, very, very popular. He was a hardcore neo-Nazi who killed people, right? But he also became very popular, and he's still very popular, in the sort of Russian, Ukrainian, among the youth, because he was kind of considered to be funny and lots of memes about him. But he got imprisoned, and he died in jail not long ago, actually, a few years ago, two years ago, after the start of the war, Russia-Ukraine war. And then all the Azov guys, they were very sad. They made lots of posts about him, this is our fighter against the regime. But then because basically, so the neo-Nazis, they have this in the post-Soviet world, they really dislike Putin. They think that Putin is a global homo, Zog, multinational. Because in Russia, I mean, Putin, and the Russian government, I mean, this is not a particularly new thing for Putin. I mean, this was kind of, in a sense, the Russian Empire had this as well. Obviously, the Soviet Union had this very much so, but very much not about, kind of emphasizing the multinational nature of the state. And, they have autonomous regions and, Chechnya, right, is this kind of a state within itself. And this is this is something that right-wing people really, really hate. They don't even, I mean, they don't want there to be any respect, obviously, towards these other traditions, but also they just don't want them to come to Moscow or whatever. And then, I mean, there's also an interesting overlap between Russian liberals as well, who they really hate sort of the fact that, Chechnya is governed by Kadyrov, in a very sort of, well, I think undeniably fairly brutal manner, and they think it's crazy, because we have this barbaric Eastern dictatorship within our country and so on. We shouldn't have this. There's kind of this point of unity between the sort of neo-Nazis and the liberals, which we can talk about a bit later. It's quite relevant in this context, the Russia-Ukraine war. But so they were leaving after 2008, pressure by the Russian government. But then a really big turning point was 2014, when in Ukraine there was this sort of large protest movement, which led to the removal of the government, the Euromaidan events. And in this, a very large role was played by radical nationalist groups, some of which who had actually just come from Russia. Others were Ukrainian and grown up in Ukraine. Most of them grew up in Ukraine, but there was quite an important contingent of these very radical Russian neo-Nazis who took part in these. And then they got rid of the government, and a new government came to power that was much more pro-Western, and also had this representation from these nationalist groups. And then in 2014, the Azovv movement emerged, and kind of not really totally worth going into the whole details of how it emerged. But what then, obviously, the Russian government and the Ukrainian government became very antagonistic. And since there were these right-wing forces that were supporting the new Ukrainian government, the Russian government began really cracking down even more on neo-Nazis in Russia. And then lots of them came more to Ukraine to escape that. But it had been happening before that already, because in Ukraine, it was just Ukraine is always, at least particularly before 2014, was a much freer place than Russia, less laws. So yeah, I guess that's the context.
I think Euromaidan kind of breaks a lot of people's brains because of that mix of, like, as that's going on, there is that weird kind of coalition and mix of people of like liberals and anarchists and Nazis and fascists that are all kind of coming together in this mix. And it doesn't fit a lot of the like cookie cutter ways that some people in the US think about events, and that kind of what you were saying. And I think maybe it'd be good to talk about a little bit more this weird sort of alliance, or not alliance, but like common cause in both Russia and Ukraine that a lot of liberals and hardcore right-wing factions find because of the different sort of, or more site-specific, we'll say, like historical developments there.
Yeah, I mean, it is like an alliance, and they are very much, I mean, especially the liberals. I think the liberals are a lot more, they're a lot more positive towards the right-wing people than maybe the right-wing are towards the liberals, because the Ukrainian liberals, they're very angry. I mean, like, because the fact of the matter is, right, so the Azovv movement emerged, we can talk about why it kind of emerged. It emerged in 2014, right after the victory of the Euromaidan movement, in which the people that would then become the Azovv movement, these small, quite very small at that point, different extreme right-wing nationalist groups, they played a major role in the Euromaidan protests. And then after the Euromaidan protests, there were counter-protests, the anti-Maidan in the east and southern part of Ukraine, and that were, more open towards, some of them were like explicitly pro-Russian, some of them were more just sort of open towards continued neutrality towards Russia, as had been the case before. But the right-wing organizations, they joined together to attack these anti-Maidan protesters, some of whom had also taken control of different state buildings, and quite a complex series of events. But essentially, they were mobilized to sort of crush sort of what they saw as the counter-revolution. And it is also interesting that they were sort of under the aegis of this figure, Arsen Avakov, who was this Armenian oligarch, was the governor of the Kharkiv region in the eastern Ukraine. And he had been a businessman and a politician in 2000s Ukraine, and this is kind of documented by the Bellingcat, Michael Colburn, in his book about Azov. He had used what would in future become Azov at that point was called Patriot of Ukraine, very small organization, in different business disputes that he had, where they would attack like his business rivals. They would also attack like Vietnamese market and like, attack them for being migrants. But in fact, it was kind of like a business rivalry and so on.
Yeah.
So and this is also an important thing that it's kind of funny in Ukraine. There's this perception of Ukrainian nationalism as being very much like a Western Ukrainian thing. And there's a historical sense in which that is true. But then if you look at Azov, it's basically overwhelmingly Eastern Ukraine, generally Russian speaking. And the reason for that is because in Ukraine, it's like these Eastern cities are where you have industrial objects, big factories, and so on, and that's where you had all the gangland violence, really, in the 90s and the 2000s, and to the present day, really, because you have competition over different industrial assets. And Western Ukraine is very, very poor. It's very rural. There's really not very much to compete over. So anyway, and then you had these muscle groups essentially to like back you up. It wasn't just like right wing. In fact, like really right wing nationalists were not like the main muscle groups you'd use as like a 90s, 2000s oligarch. It was more just different criminal groups, your own sort of private military companies and so on. But they were used to an extent, at least in Kharkiv. It's definitely proof of that. But it really became it really like dramatically increased in scope and size after 2014. And with the rise of the Azov, and then what happened with the Azov movement? It was the Ukrainian army at that point was not really ready to fight against what were its own citizens at that point in eastern Ukraine, and whereas Azov was much more willing to sort of shoot and kill other people.
Yeah, you'd be willing to like actually shell Givi.
Yeah. Well, and also because I mean, at the beginning, a lot of it was really like small skirmishes in Kharkiv and Mariupol and so on, where they were really like they were looking for anti-Maidan or what they consider like pro-Russian activists and killing them or capturing them and working in close cooperation with the secret services, the SBU, the Secret Services of Ukraine. So that was really a big thing, and then obviously there was the military operations. And Azov was still is. It's constantly growing, but it's very much like it presents itself as having an ideology and as being actually committed to like the Ukrainian state, whereas all the other institutions, they're totally corrupt and they're totally, like Soviet or Russian infested, and they have no ideology, whatever. And so it's this very kind of compelling idea of, a real an idea and so on. But in terms of liberals, they very much they have to support them, because without Azov and so on, there isn't really an army. Right now, if you in the discourse around the Ukraine war, they're always held up as being, by the Western media and by Ukrainian liberals being the most militarily advanced unit in the Ukrainian army and so on. And as this great example for the rest of the army to follow in terms of
I would say that it's probably true. There aren't. I don't think that they have conscripts, and certainly from a lot of the propaganda they do, they seem to be both better equipped, because I think they have these sort of networks of supply that are not available necessarily to other frontline units. But just more cohesive, as a whole. I think one of the main problems that we see with the Ukrainian military and complaints from members of the Ukrainian military is undertrained troops, under-equipped troops, and then C, no communication or training. No communication or training on communication. Whereas Azov really has eliminated a lot of these problems and sort of functions as this model unit for the rest of the military.
Yeah, absolutely. And that they've recently, because this is kind of a whole nother tangent, but there's this whole, in the Ukrainian sort of military blog sphere, media sphere, there's this whole kind of discourse war especially over the past few years since the full-scale war with Russia, of this struggle between the young patriotic commanders who are efficient and they don't want to risk and they don't throw away their subordinates' lives for nothing, and then opposed to them the sort of the old corrupt Soviet generals who were trained in the Soviet Union or trained in Russia, and they just throw away people like it doesn't matter, and just to get like promotions and so on. And then obviously Azov is the greatest example of the young patriotic commanders, and they're constantly interviewed by these like often USAID funded pro-Western liberal publications, which is like the biggest publications in Ukraine, like Ukrainska Pravda and whatever, all these other different things. And and they're always held up as being this example of how the army should reform. And they are actually playing a major role in the reform of the army, where now the army is moving towards a core system, towards like a NATO-based core system. And the Azov has now become one of the first of these cores. And that's also held up as this way in which the army is adopting its methods. And there are so many more and more interviews, especially the past few months, really, where the leader of Azov, Andrei Beletsky, where he constantly talks about how, if I was in charge of the entire army, how I would do this and so on. Mm-hmm. And if you just give me this amount of money, I think it's like $2 billion US, I could have the entire front along Azov lines. And it has been constantly hugely increasing. And if you just look at any Ukrainian military blogger, they all are they think Azov is the best thing ever.
If I was in charge of the Ukrainian military, what I would do is I would do a tight breakthrough along a weaker section of the Russian lines and exploit that breakthrough with armored companies or things like that, maybe just even buildings that we would erect really quickly. And then I would go to Moscow and besiege Moscow and force a surrender. But you know what? They're not consulting me, are they?
I mean, funnily enough, Azov, these guys, they actually often propose, like right now, they've really been pushing for like a sort of they're quite worried about continuing a war forever because it could lead to sort of the collapse of the Ukrainian army. And lots of them are sort of saying we need to sort of focus. I mean, they are saying, the leader, Beletsky and so on, is saying we need to focus on the defense and we can't just keep on, we can't have these unrealistic goals, which is kind of a criticism of Zelensky in a sense, because Zelensky is kind of often has been until recently saying we need to keep on pushing for the 1991 borders and so on. But anyway, that's Azov, this very important movement. I mean, I guess we could maybe talk a little bit about going back to the obviously much more important phenomenon of Nikita Nazarov and so on.
But, I think we should talk about another unit that has sort of sprung up kind of under the aegis of Ukrainian military intelligence.
Yeah. Well, out of Azov. It's explicitly
out of Azov. Yeah. But like, there's this whole. I mean, and this has been in the news a lot lately. But this has been in the news a lot lately of and over the past couple of years of these sort of deep strikes within Russian territory. Right. Like there was just that kind of, I gotta say, pretty impressive operation with the drones in the trucks they smuggled into Russia. Which I mean, it's almost like out of a movie, I hate to sound like one of these guys. It's almost like out of a movie, but it really is. Like the Ukrainians seemingly smuggled a bunch of small drones into Russia using trucks with truck drivers who might not have even known what they were transporting. They were hidden in the roofs. The roofs came off and the drones attacked air bases and I think actually attacked nuclear bombers. Mm-hmm. I mean, not obviously loaded with nuclear weapons, but it's there's been a series of these sort of assassinations and attacks on Russian territory that have kind of all been pointing to the only sort of part of the Ukrainian military combine or whatever that has been getting really favorable press, because obviously the Western media supports the Ukrainian army in many ways, but it's kind of hard to overlook a lot of the very notable failures operationally in the past few years.
The Western media does a pretty good job of overlooking.
Yeah, I know. But like there's every 6 months, there's like a new like 8,000 word New York Times thing to be like problems in the Ukrainian army. Yeah. And like, the casualties too seem to be mounting. But I think the thing that has sort of been like the shining star of Ukrainians, military command has been their intelligence and assassinations, kind of commando operations that they've been engaged upon, and that is kind of what sort of circles us back a little bit to Joshua Sutter and to 764 and to 09A, because this is not exactly, well, there's a linkage here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say also with the recent drone operations, it was also, I mean, it was actually confirmed by Zelensky, I think, like today, that the truck drivers were not aware of what they were carrying, which is kind of an interesting.
You're gonna be in trouble, fellas. You're gonna be in trouble.
Well, I mean, this is also what happened with the Ukrainian Secret Services bombing of the Crimean bridge back in 2022. Where it was a truck bomb that killed the truck driver as well, and this was just a random truck driver. And I've seen people also mention how this was apparently a tactic that was used by, like in the Irish Civil War, by like MI6 essentially.
I think also people have, I think, rightly kind of compared this like next wave of, I don't know, attacks or to the, like the Israeli pager attack, and the way that like unknown like components of just like civil and social infrastructure get weaponized sort of instantaneously as this sort of like new wave of warfare that's kind of coming out of this.
I mean, it's also often compared, especially in Russia, to like with the Chechen wars, where originally it was like, you know, a fairly conventional war, obviously with different kind of guerrilla elements and so on. But then once the Chechen side really began losing a great more, you know, there wasn't really much of a Chechen army left. There were a lot more terrorist attacks and so on, and that continued for a very long time after the Russia was in full control of the territory of Chechnya. But with the Ukrainian intelligence services, there is this funny tension in the New York Times articles where they'll, on the one hand, they'll go in really extreme detail about how the CIA and the MI6 and other different American intelligence services trained and created these structures, really, like very explicitly. These Ukrainian military intelligence, when the Ukrainian military intelligence, which is the HUR, the HUR, or the GUR, you can see it spelled sometimes as well, and main intelligence directorate, and also the Ukrainian sort of like security services of Ukraine, which is often called SBU, because that's the Ukrainian abbreviation. And so, I mean, you know, if there are a few, but so on the one hand, they'll be very clear about how we created these organizations, we trained them, and thanks to our wonderful training, they can do these wonderful missions and so on. But on the other hand, they also say, but of course, we were always very, very clear to them that you cannot do bad things inside of Russia. You know, they always say this, where you can only do things if it's inside of territory of Ukraine that's being occupied by Russia, and but nothing else. Because we obviously don't want to Russia to be angry at us, and we are only helping Ukraine in this particular aspect of its war and so on. But obviously, that's not particularly believable. And I think they'll often say that the operations inside of Russia that the Ukrainian different intelligence services claim for themselves that they have committed and they take responsibility. They'll say that this was done without our consent, but I mean that's always very. I mean it
I mean, okay.
Which guy's winking and nodding? You know, it just takes a. What do you mean? I mean, I don't know. That's always the message that comes out, and you hear it all the time over here. We had no idea. We didn't say anything. And it's all diplomatic, you know, smokescreen for what's actually, and you know, has been like hardcore reported on.
We didn't know they'd blow up Nord Stream 2.
Or just, you know, it took years and probably a Trump presidency, but finally a lot of information to hit U.S. press about like actual U.S. involvement and in a structural way, right? Like actually kind of being there.
I mean, I can also because I mean I think we can now move on to. I mean, as I said, there are two main intelligence services in Ukraine. There's the SBU and the GUR. Both are very, very like cooperate with Ukrainian and also formerly Russian or currently Russian, however you want to call them, neo-Nazis. And there's plenty of interviews with the neo-Nazis themselves where they're very proud of their help that they give to the SBU in tracking down what they call to be like pro-Russian agitators. There's, you know, several interviews, for instance, with one well-known Ukrainian neo-Nazi called Yevgen Karas of the C-14 organization, He boasts of the help he gives to the SBU in tracking down. This was before 2022 as well. This was interviews from 2018, 19. Where in tracking down pro-Russian. So it's often framed in terms of we're cooperating because we're fighting against the pro-Russian elements in Ukrainian society. Because obviously, in Ukraine, it's very much quite a divisive issue, many of these questions. But anyway, but they cooperate with the SBU. That's a big thing. But also, the SBU is a much older thing. It's essentially just it is the Ukrainian KGB. It was created from the structure of the Ukrainian KGB. They renamed it to give it the name of the SBU, which was the name that the Nazi collaborationist organization of Ukrainian nationalists that in the 1940s, 1930s, that collaborated with Nazi Germany and so on, took participation in the sort of the Holocaust and the killing of Poles and so on. They had an SBU in the 30s and the 40s, this security service of Ukraine. And then in the 90s, in newly independent Ukraine, they took this name. And then the SBU was also a sort of there were lots of different factions in the SBU. There's pro-Russian factions and just generally and also obviously pro-Western factions and just a lot of different weird kind of clan struggles over corruption, rent, and so on. And similar FSB as well in the 1990s particularly. But that was a big thing. And but then the US, they really came in and they started sponsoring the creation of this new unit in the SBU, but that was more kind of really tightly created by the Americans and without this possibility of leaks to the Russians, but still with some leaks, I'm sure. But then what the Americans really focused on was the GUR, the main intelligence directorate, and then there was this particular figure, Kirilo Budanov, who became the so, and as I understand, so he was he's described. This is I think a Washington Post article that was published a few years ago after I think in 2022, 2023, and it describes him as being like a rising star in Unit 7. What was it? Unit 2245, which I believe was in the no, it's in the GUR. That's right. But Budanov, he actually the CIA. This is in the Washington Post article. The CIA trained him and also took the extraordinary step of sending him for rehabilitation after an injury he received in the war in Ukraine. This was 2015 or 16 or so, and they sent him for rehabilitation to the Walter Reed National Military Center in Maryland.
Wow.
And then he came back.
That's where Biden gets his colonoscopies.
Oh, there you go. Let's go. But also, there are lots of rumors about Budanov himself. Not really rumors, because I think it's fairly because Budanov. There are rumors essentially that he was in the right-wing football hooligan scene in his youth. I don't really think it's a rumor because he is the number one patron of Ukrainian neo-Nazis today, and they all love him. And there were recent sort of rumors over the past year or so. There's been rumors that maybe the government might try to sort of demote Budanov. He has too much influence. And then when these rumors appeared, there was all of the Ukrainian neo-Nazi groups. They all said, no, don't do this. In particular, the Football Hooligan Association, they put out a whole statement of Budanov's the best guy ever and so on. I also want to read out some. This is from about Nord Stream, because you mentioned this. For a little bit of context, so it's now in the GUR where you have a wide range of units that are very explicitly neo-Nazi, and we'll talk about one in a second. But there's also a rap group called the Nord Division.
Like a rap, as in this
they do freestyle things, and you can look them up. They're pretty big. They have hundreds of thousands of views. And so they're like a Ukrainian military musical group with and they're all Azov guys and so on. But they have songs. I've taken the time to translate the lyrics as well, sort of labor of love. And I have to sort of read out. This is from their kind of one of the most popular freestyles on YouTube, which it's 20-minute freestyle. And I have to read out the translated English subtitles. So
absolutely.
Why are we so bold? Kirilo Budanov supervises us. He gives us assignments about what and about whom. If he says not to release a track, we don't release it. We're good members, damn it. We were blasting in Bakhmut. We fucked Kadyrov. Dr. Mengele, this is still like concentration camp. Yes, I've seen the future, and we didn't lose there. Nord Division is like blowing up the Kursk submarine. Historical note, a lot of Russians died there. All of Ukraine, also one note, this is mainly wrapped in Russian as well, like in the Russian language, because most like of these guys are actually from Russia. At least a lot of them are. Or the Ukrainians who are Russian speaking. Anyway, continuing. All of Ukraine's counterintelligence says that we are art. Before interviews, Budanov listens to our tracks in Russian. Nord Division is like the terrorist attack in the Russian metro, where women and children died. And now I feel warmth in my soul. Nord Stream exploded. For that, we thank the GUR and the SBU. Now I bring news. A very sad one for you, my friend. The war won't end, because it's not beneficial to anyone. 2024, a new war in the new year. You bastards will pay in blood. Enemies of common sense and the white race. A white key is on my shoulder. This is a neo-Nazi symbol. Stand when the lieutenant speaks to you. Lie on the floor when the Russian Volunteer Corps comes in. The Russian Volunteer Corps is going to be the main topic of I think, the next hour or so, what we're going to talk about. And this is a unit in Budanov's GUR. So lie on the floor when the Russian Volunteer Corps comes in. A sig heil to everyone and goodbye. We want to reclaim our native land. The gas van is coming. Climb in. Now we're going to clean the streets in Moscow. We will leave our mark in the dark where the light of the Holy Rus will crush all of you now. So anyway.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a classic rap song. It is, I don't mean I love everybody in the world, but I got to tell you, when Europeans, and I'm including, Ukrainians listening to this, I'm including you in this. When Europeans rap, it gets into a territory that I'm not exactly comfortable in. So he mentions in these beautiful lyrics a Russian volunteer unit, and he mentions lying on the ground when they come in, possibly some sort of military term for lovemaking. I'm not sure. These guys were in the news a bunch for kind of a couple brief videos they did more than anything. And they are sort of the what we've been kind of leading up to with this talk of O9A and GUR and kind of connecting all of these things. Who are these guys? Just in a kind of like top line thing, what is the Russian volunteer units? Who are these guys? What's going on here?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not actually that hard to describe who they are. These are Russian neo-Nazis who migrated to Ukraine around or before 2014. The main figures in this, at least. These were quite well-known figures in the Russian hardcore neo-Nazi scene. And they became very, very strong supporters of the Azov movement in Ukraine as soon as it emerged. And then in 2022, late 2022, they formed a unit, the Russian Volunteer Corps, which states as its purpose to sort of like, it's a Russian unit, which is on the side of Ukraine. Originally, there was a kind of pretense of it being independent, but Reuters, according to Reuters, so Reuters is not a Russian propaganda source, I've been informed, it is a unit of the GUR. And I mean, they are also open about the fact that they are a unit of the GUR, the Russian Volunteer Corps, I mean. And Budanov himself is also, he's more and more like, at first he sort of made this coy joke of like, oh, they're our friends and they're helping us. But now he's pretty open about it. And in their videos, they sort of, as members of, anyway, so it's not a secret at all. And Western media says this and so on. So that's what the GUR are. Sorry, not the GUR, the RDK, Russian Volunteer Corps. The RDK is just like the Ukrainian Russian abbreviation for it. And I'm just sort of used to that. So I just call them by that. They're just very, very extreme neo-Nazis, more like extreme and in your face than the rest of Azov. Azov tries to sort of hide often, especially in its sort of communications, its beliefs.
Yeah, they took out the Black Sun.
Well, they still have it. I mean,
sometimes they take out the Black Sun.
Yeah, they made a thing about how they claim to remove it. But I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the Azov, they're into this kind of meta-politics idea of these like French like post-right, whatever. I mean, right-wing guys, basically, in the 1980s of like, and the idea is that society is not normalized to, society gets really freaked out by fascism. So we need to sort of gradually reintroduce it, but be kind of coy about our intentions and so on. And Azov, ideologists are very into this idea. Elena Semeniaka, she's like the leading sort of philosopher of the Azovv movement. She's really into this idea, metapolitics of gradually. Yeah, probably. Yeah, she met with Sutter. So Sutter came to her conference, and she's like close friends with not close friends, but she is an associate of Sutter, Caleb Sutter. But the RDK guys, they don't really care about metapolitics. They're just into Hitler and esoteric Hitlerism, and they just talk about this all the time. So that's the overall. We can go, and now we can,
Yeah. So how do these guys get started? I mean, you mentioned that they're sort of these like Nazis from Russia who migrated to Ukraine.
Yeah.
When did they get started in terms of becoming like a military unit?
In 2022.
And kind of what in 2022, and what has that unit done exactly?
Yeah, I mean it's quite a small unit. Like there's kind of estimates of like a few hundred people or so. But I mean they really came to prominence. It was, I think, like March 2023, something like that. In 2023, where they had these different raids into the border areas of Russia. So in the Bryansk region, and the Belgorod region, and so on. These are in the northern, southern Russia, obviously, but bordering with Ukraine. So in the northern part of Ukraine. But these were very small raids. I mean, since there's not many people in there, but it's just that they weren't very well guarded, these areas. I mean, it's obviously a huge border region. It's 1,000 kilometers or so. And they took some videos and went in. The Russian government accused them of murdering civilians that they encountered. But they didn't. It was very much like a media show. In terms of showing, and this is like a very big part of the Russian Volunteer Corps. They have a very, very active online presence, because obviously the whole purpose is to attract Russians to join their cause and to fight on the side of Ukraine against Russia. And apart from fighting in the RDK specifically, there's also a German Volunteer Corps, by the way, and they're linked by the Russian Volunteer Corps in the Telegram. The German Volunteer Corps is extremely, extremely pro-Hitler and very, very, very about that. And they also fight on the side of Ukraine. But anyway, back to the Russian Volunteer Corps. They also really encourage their followers on Telegram to do various actions inside of Russia. So throwing a Molotov cocktail into a Russian, law enforcement office, or into a Russian military, anything building associated with the Russian army or the Russian law enforcement and so on. And I mean, this is also, something that both countries essentially do, where they, and I mean, essentially this in many contemporary conflicts where in Israel and so on, there's different reports where Iran, they'll pay people on the internet to do different things. And it often starts from a small thing, like drawing some graffiti that's fuck Netanyahu or something in whatever language, and then it's also similar, but then it increases, and they get paid for it a little bit or something, and but then it increases. They ask you to do more and more, and then throwing a Molotov cocktail, or obviously it could be even kind of violent actions as well. And it's a similar thing where the Ukrainian government, they accuse the Russian intelligence services of doing the same thing in Ukraine, where they will pay often young people in Ukraine. This is what Ukrainian government claims. The Russian intelligence services will pay Ukrainian teams to attack, particularly mobilization offices that have a lot of public hatred against them in Ukraine because of their sort of violent methods of mobilizing people. And so they'll attack mobilization vehicles. It's a very big issue in Ukraine at the moment for the past 6 months, a year or so. And anyway, so the RDK encourages its followers to do the same thing in Russia. And they'll, with throwing Molotov cocktails or attacking whatever things. And then, so the important context, a little bit more about what the RDK is. So that there are two leaders, basically two leaders, or most prominent figures in them. There's Denis Nikitin, also known as White Rex. He has a clothing brand called White Rex, which is...
These guys all, by the way, all have clothing brands.
It's really big. Yeah.
What's up with that?
I have no idea, but it's a huge thing.
Just like side hustle?
On Instagram,
branding?
I just follow a bunch of Ukrainian Nazi warrior guys, And they all like half of their posts are like, we're fucking get ready. We're going to go fucking kill some people. And then the other ones will be like 6 ads in a row for like their fucking, their new clothing brand. There is a huge subsection of like Ukrainian professional soldiers who are also now professional sort of like, I mean, frankly, probably drop shipping, like, merchandise guys.
Yeah. There's also Svaston, which is a big one. And that's also a big sort of Ukrainian neo-Nazi clothing brand. It's often also worn by this guy, Sergei Sternenko, who's like a liberal allied Ukrainian neo-Nazi. He's very like close with different liberal NGOs and stuff in Ukraine. But he's kind of opposed to the Azov guys. Anyway, so that's all different, interesting subplot. But so Nikitin is from Russia, but he lived in Germany for lots of his life. He's actually been banned but he moved to Ukraine. He was a football hooligan, and he's actually been banned from the Schengen. He's banned from visiting the EU from 2019 because of his violent neo-Nazi beliefs. And so I mean, like I guess like one interesting thing about the RDK is that Western media coverage about them, even from the beginning when they had their whole, raids into Russia, which were kind of like, hyped up to an extent in the Western media, obviously in Ukrainian media was very hyped up. But even from the beginning, Western media was very, very clear that these people are very, very bad, very neo-Nazi, in a way that they really have done the opposite thing with Azov, where they've said, well, there are some weird extremist figures in there, but they've cleaned up their act. And generally, they don't even really mention it anymore with Azov. But I mean, the RDK their leaders have always said, like, our whole purpose is to serve the Azov movement. They are all of the different Azov, like they're in the Azov movement. And I mean, it's also worth mentioning that Azov is a large movement that encompasses a wide range of different military units, many different military units, and then also many different civic organizations, and so on. Civic organizations, obviously, in a sort of charitable sense of the term. But so that Nikitin, he's one guy. And then there's also another big guy, Alexei Levkin, and he is also Russian, and he came directly to Ukraine. He didn't spend any time in Europe. He also came around 2014 or so to Ukraine. But he's a very well-known figure in the Russian neo-Nazi scene. He is the sort of the guy in charge of the Wotan Jugend community.
The Wotan Jugend?
Yes. So the Wotan.
No.
So I mean, he describes himself as like an esoteric Hitlerist. He has like candle wax, like Hitler birthday sort of sessions.
Oh, there you go. Great.
Yeah, and he also has. So one of the things is the Wotan Jugend community, which is he posts like, and that's been around since the 2000s. It's really like it's been
that's
around
like
for ages.
A Telegram channel or what?
Well, I mean, as I understand, it's mainly. I mean, it's Telegram. It may have been a forum at some point. Right now, it's mainly a Telegram thing, and he posts his sort of esoteric philosophical essays and so on about different. They're really into paganism. Azov guys are also very much into paganism. That's a big thing. Yeah. But these guys are really, really into paganism, Levkin. But Levkin also has a National Socialist black metal group called M8L8TH, obviously 88, Heil Hitler. It's also called Hitler's Hammer because, like, the word, like in Russian, it means hammer. And that group is also been around for a long time, and it's quite popular and so on in this scene.
NSBM.
And NSBM also obviously is for a long time been a big thing in Ukraine, particularly in the city of Kharkiv, which is, if any enjoyers of NSBM out there, that's where lots of the big Ukrainian NSB cities came from. And that's also the city where the Azov movement really came from, the city of Kharkiv.
Let me interrupt you real quick.
Yeah.
I got something to say about BM and NSBM. And this is not, I love Baby Mamas, but I hate black metal. It's all the same song. I'm sorry. Whether you're singing about Hitler or you're one of these ones that's like singing about nature or whatever, which is also Hitler, it's all, and it's the same song, and I don't like the song. It's grindcore without blast beats. It's just, black metal to me is just, and people are not gonna like this, but it's one of my most hated genres of music. It's so corny, but the songs aren't good. It's worse than black people music, and it's worse than metal music.
Yep, 100% true. And I mean, it is worth mentioning that Levkin is still very much into his musical career, despite serving in the RDK, and as being sort of like one of like the leader alongside Nikita. Levkin there's also like an NSBM festival called Asgard Frey, Asgard Sray, and Levkin sort of organizes. Well, this is it's his music project. He had a recent concert, Yule Night. He also has like a label, which is also like a merch thing called Militant Zone. Anyway, that's got lots of like occult literature, merchandise, music. But there was actually an interview with Levkin by the Armia Inform, which is like the Ukrainian army's official media, media publication, where they do different interviews with great soldiers. And they had a big interview with Levkin this year in 2025, and they talked for a long time about, I believe they called it like the right-wing movement, his experience as a representative of the Russian right-wing movement, and, and so on and so on. And also a long thing about Asgard Ray and his recent Yule Night? Yeah, Yule Night concert. And the I think it's the drummer or maybe the vocalist in I always like how to pronounce it. I always write it. So it's like M8 L8, but it's like Hitler's Hammer. Let's just call it Hitler's Hammer because that's kind of like the fan name for it. Hitler's Hammer. The other lead vocalist of Hitler's Hammer is a well-known Azov guy in the Azov battalion. But yeah, so they asked him about how Yule Night went. He talks about it for a lot. He talks about that for like a huge part of the interview, his music career. But what's interesting about this is, he has this really quite big network of fans in Russia, and these online communities, like people who are into Hitler's Hammer, and also the subscribers to Walter and Jugend. These are like tens of thousands of people, 40,000 and so on. And mainly in Russia, really. And I guess that's the main figures. And I guess now we can maybe get to a less appreciated member of the RDK, because when you read the Western media reports about RDK, they'll generally talk about Nikitin, how he was banned from EU, and how he's like really bad neo-Nazi and so on, and also about Levkin, who's also very, very not a very good guy. I'm not going to tell you the lyrics of the Hitler's Hammer songs. You can obviously guess what they're about. It's about Holocaust, blah blah. But I think the Nord Division lyrics were kind of more entertaining in a certain sense and interesting, because talking about the Budanov and so on. But there's another member of the RDK, and his name is Alexei Konakhin. Should we begin talking about him?
Absolutely. Yeah. What's his deal?
So his deal is, it's actually interesting. He's actually, he was an actor originally. This is a recurring story in, I guess, the world, right? Show business entering politics. So Konakhin was originally an actor in Russia. And there's actually another, on the topic of show business, and one of the press secretary, whatever, of the RDK, he's actually the son of an important figure in the Kvartal 95, which is Zelensky's comedy studio, which has been around since the 2000s. And his son is this hardcore neo-Nazi press secretary of the RDK. He actually has a really funny quote, his son, about Zelensky. I can actually read it out to you. He said about Zelensky, this is an interview that he gave, Zelensky presented himself in such a way that I was completely taken aback. So he's met Zelensky because his father has known Zelensky forever, because he was working in the comedy studio that Zelensky was the main comedian of. So Zelensky's rhetoric, and especially the fact that Israel is indeed maintaining a neutrality favorable to Russia, leads me to think that Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky is, after all, our kike. Sorry.
No, you're forgiven. You have the pass.
Sorry. In Churchill's sense, he puts this in brackets, and not just Zog. That's Zelensky. So he's not just Zog. He's actually our.
So
our
they give him, which is funny because that is such like an echo of like the 4chan shit of like our guy or whatever, how they describe people.
Yeah.
God. Well, these people, I mean, it's so crazy because you do have to do these kind of weird mental gymnastics because like ultimately your leader is a Jew, like of your country. Well, and these guys sort of like they kind of just paint him as like he's either one of the good ones, but they also are kind of more willing to turn on him.
I also forgot a wonderful fact as well, that Nikitin, the leader of the RDK, he's from a Jewish family. And he, fantastically, he most likely, I think either definitely or most likely, was able to gain asylum in Germany as like a Russian Jew on some kind of program.
Amazing. Well, it mirrors how the fact that in the early 2000s there were these Nazi skinhead groups forming in Israel of like oftentimes Eastern Europeans who had migrated over there with the law of return because they'd had like a Jewish grandparent or maybe they hadn't.
Yeah.
And they sort of started forming these like Nazi sort of hooligan street gangs in Israel.
Yeah. I mean, I will just say, this is kind of tangential, but I mean, the sort of Jewishness in, this is also someone whose family is like sort of culturally Jewish. I mean, Jewish, I think at a certain point were Jewish. Definitely were Jewish at a certain point. But what happened in the Soviet Union is you really did have this kind of denationalization. I mean, everyone became a little bit Jewish in the Soviet Union. I'm going to say that. And then the Jews became less Jewish. And I don't think that's bad. I think that's fine. Everyone became a little bit of everything. And there's actually a term that Russian neo-Nazis have, which is the Novyop, which is like it's like the new, whatever the fuck. But basically it's this idea that like Soviet Union denationalized the Russians.
Yeah.
And it made them into like these denationalized intellectual cucks, right? And
it's fun. It's funny. You see this in the 90s and the 2000s, and even now a lot. Like Russian people sort of acting like, we're becoming a minority in our own country. Like the majority becomes the oppressed minority, sort of in their telling of events. And they're, oppressed by the either Judeo-Bolshevism or just even in general, like this denationalization that happened during the Soviet Union.
Yeah. But I will also say that, like, I mean, the RDK and stuff, they also have this idea that the ethnic Russians are oppressed in Russia, but also that all of the ethnic, well, I mean, like, sometimes they say this, sometimes not, but like all the ethnic groups are oppressed. And that's why we need to destroy Russia. And we need to have like a bunch of ethnic confederations working together. And they also have, a part of the RDK is these like North Siberian separatist groups, Karelian. And they also, they do a lot of stuff working together with these other groups that advocate splitting up Russia on ethnic lines with a million different states and so on.
Funny enough, that's also a very popular position at the U.S. State Department.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is this convergence between these liberal and they use this rhetoric of like the decolonization of Russia and so on. Yeah. And I mean, this also goes way back to World War II, where you had the Nazis also had this. They did try at certain points to ally with some of the Muslim populations in Russia, and they allied with the Ukrainian nationalists who had this whole, and they had this, it was like the Bloc of Oppressed Nations or something in 1943, led by the Ukrainians. And this was like a network as well that went back a little bit before the 20s and 30s, like this Prometheus network.
That also, they sort of similar thing when like the Bloc of Oppressed Nations, but then also post World War II, like, the anti-communist league and all this kind of stuff. Exactly. Very similar thing.
Well, it was led by the Ukrainians. The anti-communist bloc is like the Ukrainians, the organization of the Ukrainian nationalists. Forget the guy's name, but like this, and that was an explicitly like a CIA front group. But I mean, but they had plenty of their own resources as well. And then with the South Korea and Taiwan, all these different things, all these guys. And this idea that, Russia is, the Soviet Union is a prison house of nations, the same as the Russian Empire, and we need to liberate all these nations and so on and so These organizations still exist today. I mean, there's like the Mars Robeson, this kind of writer on Substack. There's lots of great
He's
research.
been on the show. He's been on the show.
Oh, there you go. Well, he does lots of great research in these networks, decolonization type of thing. But it's interesting because it networks with this Russian right-wing idea that we need to get rid of the ethnic republics because we don't like them, right? Because they're not white. We need to get rid of them. We don't need them in our state. And I mean, plenty of Russian liberals are also very racist in general. That's kind of, and much more openly racist as well. I mean, like Ukrainian liberals as well. In Eastern Europe, it's a lot more normal to be racist. I'll put that out there. And especially, and you have this general kind of class sort of racism that's much more normal, where the sort of, I mean, true in many countries, but especially there, where sort of the urban middle class liberal elite, which is a very small group of the population, they really look at the rest of the country as being these barbaric, savages and so on. Anyway, but I mean, I got a little bit sidetracked, but Kirill Kanakhin, RDK guy, show business, failed comedian, and he's interesting because he's a fighter in the RDK, and the reason why I bring him up is because he is like he's openly about the fact that he was a member of an O9A, Order of Nine Angels, Nexion or cell in Russia for several years, and he talks about this in his Telegram. You can see it, and he talks about this. He now claims to be like a new ideology, also this Hinduist type of thing. They're really into these, there was that woman, what's it, like Sanskreya something?
Savitri Devry.
That's right.
I think.
Yeah. This European Nazi in the 1940s who worked with Hitler and so on, and
but was in India and created this sort of esoteric Hinduism that sort of became more prominent in the definitely only became prominent in the post sort of Third Reich international Nazi scene. Yeah. Well, I was part of Order of the Nine Angles in Russia.
Yeah, that's right. So like there was this, and this ties back. So basically, Martina Press, Caleb Sutter, they published this book in 2015 called "The Kiss of Marina." I was spelled with Marina. What was it, like Kiss of Marina, Black Sun or something? Had Black Sun in the name, but the main thing was Kiss of Marina. And it was published by Martina Press, the Caleb Sutter FBI funded publishing company, which publishes all these insane, awful books with murder and all kinds of bad actions. I haven't read Kisses Marina. As I understand from the synopses that I've read, it's not like really, really. I think they do like serial killings. But basically, the plot is this guy finds this cool, dark, intellectual guy, and he has like a knife club. Right-wing people are really into knives. They really like knife clubs in Ukraine, Russia, and it's a big thing. But he joins this knife club, and then he initiates him into like this occult ideology, and ends up like becoming a serial killer, as I understand. So one of the only mentions of this book was by Kirill Kanakhin. In 2021 on his Telegram, and you can still find this on his Telegram, like it's all on there, and I have links and you can read it for yourself if you want. So he reposted a video of himself reading this poem, The Crusade of the Children, and he said that he wrote it in 2012, and this poem actually gained popularity through Levkin's Wotan Jugend community, so we've talked about it before, but this was back in the 2012 period. The video begins, like in the video, there's a reference to the O9A Russian Nexion called the Temple of the Black Sun. And then the poem continues. I'm not going to read all the poem. I have it in my article. But it is kind of an interesting poem in that the whole topic of the poem is children. I'll read one bit. Like, against the vile adult world, against your beloved whores, against your treasured idols, children will take up knives, children will take up pistols, children will shatter illusions, boosting newspaper circulations. And you'll spew bile, lounging on kitchen sofas. Who taught them to kill? How can they hate so deeply? And then blah, blah, different stuff. He makes a reference to like Kristallnacht and stuff, but it's called The Crusade of the Children. And I think it's kind of an interesting it's interesting that he has this idea back in 2012 of kind of essentially like manipulating children, right, to commit violent acts. I mean, that's the only reading of the story of the poem that there is. And then he also says in his telegram that the Temple of the Black Sun, he writes, was a Moscow-based group operating within the Order of Nine Angels, a circle that formed my main social circle for several years. The video was actually first published in 2013. It was dedicated to the National Socialist Organization North, which is a group that was arrested in Russia for dozens of murders, mainly, obviously, of migrant, non-ethnically Russian migrants. And this is a group that's quite often praised as well in RDK media and Botanjugend and so on, even quite recently, because they're just this very, very extreme anti-government Russian neo-Nazi group. It's also interesting that, I mean, like this video by Konakhin was filmed in the Kola Peninsula, which is this very far northern part of Russia, close to Finland and the White Sea and so on, where obviously neo-Nazis, they're really into the whole like Arctic, Antarctic type of thing, Hitler hiding out there.
Yeah, and also that's where the Aryan Promised Land is. Exactly.
It's where they should stay there. I think it'd be fine.
Agartha, I think it is.
Yeah, maybe they could just stay up there. It's like -40 all the time. I've actually been up there around that area, not as part of the Order of the Nine Angles, as a young child on a sort of holiday. It's not a nice place though. There's so many mosquitoes. I don't know. It's really, really bad.
Yeah, I'm good. So he's writing this sort of stuff that's like that almost can be interpreted as like very much in line with a lot of the 76409A, like go out and kill, like young people go out and kill kind of ideology.
Yeah, and I mean there was some arrests in Russia for people that committed ritual murders in the Kola Peninsula that were like 09A associated people. They were arrested quite recently in 2024. They were Satanists that ate and cooked victims, but they were found in relation to the drug smuggling, which is interesting. And like, I mean, Konakhin, his telegram, he has photos from the Kola Peninsula where they made like shrines, like occult shrines with rocks. And this was actually like a shrine that was used in the cover of Kiss of Morenos. And there's also like, there's this investigative journalist, Russian investigative journalist that goes, anti-fascist investigative journalist actually, who goes deep into the whole like Konakhin story and finds other evidence that like he interviewed this woman that illustrated the book. So basically he was involved with this book. And it is also just worth, I guess, mentioning again that the way that O9A works, because it's not an organization, it's really they have publishers and people read their books and this kind of inspires them to do all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And the books are intended, they have all these different instructions. You can get all this magic points if you do this and so on. But Konakhin said in 2021 on his telegram, he said that I participated in O9A rituals multiple times, but never underwent formal initiation into their tradition. I mean, like what formal initiation is, like no one really knows, whatever. But he says that he engaged in rituals in Kola Peninsula, which is very, very sus, to put it mildly. But then in terms, so I mean, that's like his main connection with the ONNA. He said he was connected. Now he says he's into his weird Hinduist thing. And then it's also interesting where, like, if you look at the content of the RDK, of which Konakhin is a member, and he's lived in Ukraine, I think, since 2014 or so. And he's always was very big in the Azovv movement, really big into tattoos, really big into yoga. He's like a big yoga guy. And Hindu yoga type thing. And but he's kind of like, I would say he's maybe the third most visible figure in the ONNA. He's very close friends with Levkin. They do lots of stuff together. They're involved in Militant Zone together, this merch brand and so on. But it's also interesting. I mean, if you look at the conference, the online content put out, the sort of, I guess, the metaphors they use, not metaphors, but the concepts they use. For instance, in June 2023, Wotan-Jugend called on Russian neo-Nazis to join them in the fighting in Belgorod. So this was when the the RDK did these raids into Belgorod, this Russian region bordering with Ukraine. And I'm going to quote what they said. Well, then, couch potatoes, is it not the Rehowa yet? So they were sort of saying, like, if you're a real neo-Nazi and you believe in the Rehowa, which is the racial holy war, which is considered the sort of, it's what we all need to be striving for, you need to participate on our side because we're destroying the Noviop multinational government of Vladimir Putin, who's a neo-Bolshevik, and so that's what they call him. And you participate on our side, otherwise you're a couch potato. You don't really take it seriously. So I mean, some people have done that. They've gone to join them. Obviously, it's quite a small group. But yeah, that's Kanakin. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because you kind of can't help but like draw these connections to the methods of warfare that, I mean, I'm not just talking about in Ukraine now, but like in general that can kind of be deployed. There's these, I mentioned it sort of at the top here, but like the 764, sort of the Telegram kind of like network, which is again, like, it's not like a hierarchical thing. It's just very decentralized, kind of like groups of, Discord and Telegram and whatever other channels that don't really have any central leadership that sort of like spring up, and then they'll have these offshoots, and then those offshoots will have offshoots. But overall, there's this sort of mass desensitization towards like gore, towards killing. There's this ramping up of like killing animals and then killing homeless people that really mirrors a lot of, especially the skinhead violence we saw in the 1990s in Russia. I mean, just sort of as a I don't know what comparison there. But it's one would think that if someone was trying to destabilize a country, that this would actually be like a pretty good little, addition to an arsenal there. And I'm not making claims that there is a 764 sort of unit of the GUR or whatever. I think just in general, one can think of this as like both decentralized and probably bottom up in a way. Exhortations to mass violence that sometimes get carried out that are just sort of part of our nihilistic times, and that's nihilistic violence that matches that. But you can also, kind of imagine that, like, if somebody kind of knows what they're doing and is very creative, like this could be a good way to, for instance, the RDU, when they have these sort of, one of their propaganda tactics is to have people like basically take a picture with a gun, like in a Russian town or whatever, and be like, we have people everywhere. And there's sort of this like decentralized nature to all of it, and this like lone wolf-ness to all of it that I think is really interesting. People talk a lot about fourth generation warfare, but if you're getting real, like this would be an integral component to fourth generation warfare, because it is so like possible with the technology that we have now, and also just with the way that people are desensitized now. Like looking at gore stuff is like way more common, I think, among young people now, or certain kinds of young people now, than it was like when we were kids. Yeah, there was Rotten.com. I saw a lot of nasty shit on the internet, and then I feel like that kind of went away for a little bit, but now it's huge. I mean, 8chan, 4chan, whatever, is all kind of like a minor version of this. But there are these huge sort of like pedophile, Nazi, nihilistic, whatever networks that kind of entrap people. I mean, I remember reading about this guy. This was like, I think, a big Washington Post or something article about this. But this like Russian 14-year-old girl and several other people on Discord basically got this mentally ill American guy that was like part of their Discord networks to self-immolate on camera when he was in Central Asia. And it's like, I think about that, and, you sort of extrapolate that outwards to like, if you were really sort of serious about this and really wanted to get some shit done, this would be a decent arsenal, or a decent addition to any arsenal.
Absolutely. I mean, like, I can also just say a few. One thing is also, it's worth noting, is that Wotan and Jugend, they explicitly glorify like Brenton Tarrant, the mass murderer,
yes,
who killed 50, I think, people in New Zealand mosque in 2020 or something. And he visited Ukraine and Russia, according to, I don't know, New Zealand government or something. I mean, that's an established fact. We don't know what he did while he was there.
He told people he got training with Azov, but like, we don't know if that's actually true. He could have just been talking shit.
I mean, like, one thing I should say in relation to that, but I mean, also with Wotan Jugend, they also glorify like Timothy McVeigh and Anders Breivik, and they translated Brenton Tarrant's manifesto into Ukrainian, into Russian. And I mean, like, there's just on the topic of the Tarrant style stuff, there was an interesting investigation that was done. It's like a Bellingcat article, 2019 Bellingcat article, and they talked about one guy, Joachim Furholm, who's a Norwegian guy that joined Azov in 2018, and he told this documentary filmmaker that he intended to carry out terrorist attacks back home. And he said that we've been training with Azov, blah, 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 with other people from around the world. And he said that once he's done what was expected of him by his hosts, he will proceed to direct action aimed at the West, including attacks on the government of Norway. I'd target the government with anything necessary. He gave interviews with different American Radio Werewolf, which is this, obviously extreme neo-Nazi.
And that's of course the name of the Nazi stay-behind organization they tried to set up at the end of World War II.
Yeah, it's kind of like the whole Angleton sort of tongue-in-cheek references to, But and he says, like, I want to lead a group of volunteers from all over the West and come back and spread there. And there's also Bellingcat. They found Instagram things where Furholm wrote to an Instagram user that was posing with a gun, like talking about how minorities win, like the sort of 4chan thing. Basically, I'm going to do a shooting of minorities in the U.S. And Joachim was trying to get him to come over to Ukraine. So there's that thing. But then I guess that's more of like in terms of in the West. But then what is interesting, and we can maybe, if we have time to come back to Kasap, we can also talk about that a bit more. But I mean, in terms of Ukraine and Russia, like what you were saying, in terms of like irregular warfare and psychological operations, there was, when there were these first RDK attacks on the neighboring regions in Russia, there were some articles. This was from a Politico article, where they talked with Budanov and so on about the RDK, and Budanov says that he plans more cross-border attacks by the Russian Volunteer Corps, and what he says is the goal is to show that Vladimir Putin cannot protect the population from the war getting into Russia. This is a quote from Budanov from the Politico article. When you're sitting, say, in St. Petersburg, and you're seeing the war only on TV, you will always be supportive. But people start to get nervous when some facility is attacked near their house. And then he also shows, images from a Telegram channel showing Russian civilians in the town of Belgrade surveying damage to local buildings. And he says that the damage was caused by Russian anti-aircraft missiles shot at Ukrainian drones. But he says that the traumatizing effect on the population was the same. That's the term that's used in the article, this traumatizing effect. And he says that Putin's war is supported by over 70% of Russians, which, obviously has relevance in this context. And then you can sort of tie this, what Budanov says, the leader of the military intelligence, and if you look at the posts by the RDK on their Telegram, this is a really recent post from April 2025. And I mean, this was when I wrote this article. I just got the latest post, but they have posts like this basically every day. This is the main purpose of the RDK Telegram, to propagandize these types of actions. And so the quote is, unknown heroes set fire to the entrance of the FSB's main building in Moscow. The main product that Putin's system sells to the people of Russia is security. For security, we wage wars on distant frontiers. For it, security forces read your private messages. They fight for law enforcement. The raids by the Russian Volunteer Corps have shattered the illusion of security. And just days ago, right in the heart of Moscow, concerned Russian citizens proved and sent us proof of publication that the FSB cannot even ensure its own safety. So how can it protect its citizens? And I think that's quite interesting, where it's this idea that, in order to break Russian support for the war, Russian civilians need to feel insecure that their law enforcement's not able to protect them.
This was the same with the strategy of tension which I think a lot of people kind of just lump in as being like a Gladio thing, which it was Gladio was part of the strategy of tension. But the strategy of tension really is to make people feel like their government can't protect them, and to make things feel unsafe and random and tense. So this is all very depressing. But let's go back to Kassab, where it all began. Because I think he is, God, I mean, I read through those court documents, or I read through the affidavit, and it is really depressing. But what do you think his place is in all of this?
Well, I mean, like, what's interesting is that so different researchers into Kassab, when this took place, they found that he'd interacted with the Telegram channels of the Misanthropic Division, which is another like weird semi-group, but it does exist. It has a popular Telegram channel, and it describes itself. It's got like 20,000 followers. And the Misanthropic Division's also been around since 2014 in Ukraine, and it's also composed mainly of like Russian neo-Nazis that came to Ukraine. They write in Russian or in English, and they describe themselves as being like a support unit for Azov, but they have very much like an international reach. They write in English a lot. They're also interesting in that they publicly support school shootings, and they post on their Telegram support about any school shooting in the U.S. They say that it's great, and they use this slang in the Russian neo-Nazi subculture of actions, which is like basically originally an action was when you kill or attack like a migrant. So, and this term of actions, it evolved to include any sort of violent act, like killing homeless people, and any anti-state, like killing a police officer and so on. But Misanthropic Division, they use this to refer to school shootings as well. And in this context as well, I mean, I'll also mention, I sort of wrote a lot more about this, but that different school shootings in Russia, they often, the people involved in that, sometimes they wear Hitler's hammer shirts or have been seen with that sort of paraphernalia, and are interested in this kind of subculture. But Kassab was on the Misanthropic Division forums and these Telegram channel, and these are in English often. So I mean, I think if he was talking to someone that was a Russian-speaking person in Ukraine, which is how the affidavit describes it, like a Russian-speaking person in Ukraine, talking about right-wing accelerationist thought, it would be someone in the Misanthropic Division. These are the guys that are really into this sort of thing, and they were encouraging him to use like a drone to attack Trump, which is also kind of fairly on point for Russia-Ukraine war.
FPV drones,
drones, which are very cheap. He actually got the materials for the drone as well. It describes this. So he was actually fairly seriously trying to go through with this. Obviously, I mean, he was killing people as well. So he wasn't just, fantasizing about this. He also asked about the RDK. He asked if it was true that they are sponsored by Jewish people, because there's this Russian liberal oligarch Nevzlin who is said to finance the RDK. He's an Israeli citizen as well, and the RDK is also supported by Khodorkovsky, a famous Russian liberal anti-Putin opposition oligarch, blah blah blah, who's also of Jewish descent, as I believe. Anyway, so he was a little bit skeptical of the RDK, but he was skeptical because they might not be Nazi enough, which is kind of a funny thing to say. But so yeah, and I mean, and you can look at the posts about when the news event happened. If you go on the Telegram channels of Misanthropic Division and different Ukrainian right-wing channels, they're supportive. They're like, oh, cool guy, but they were sort of in a joking way, why did you just kill your parents? That's dumb. Who really cares? And you should have you should have gone through with Trump, because obviously they don't like Trump very much. They think he's not supportive of more military aid to Ukraine and so on. So originally they were they do kind of like Trump because they think he's like a right wing kind of guy. But then when he became president, they became pretty annoyed with him.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of the cuss-up story, I guess.
Well, Jesus Christ, Peter. Thank you for joining us.
We just went around the world and back like 3 or 4 times, I feel like.
There are some pretty detailed articles discussing this and a lot of other shit on Peter's Substack. That is Events in Ukraine. I got to tell you, I'm a subscriber. It's a great Substack. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm really glad we found time to do this.
Well, what did we learn?
Well, I learned that if I have a child, if I start talking to the children that I already have, they're not going on Roblox. Because, a lot of this recruiting happens, Liz, on Roblox.
I know.
Should we be on there?
No.
Hey, have you heard about,
to promote the podcast?
Have you heard about TrueAnon? Talking to a 9-year-old on there. We went on. Do you remember when we went? That was one of our best episodes when we went into the virtual world.
Oh, yeah. Of course I remember.
We should do a follow-up. See how
well,
it's going on now.
There was a news item that said that Meta was discussing business opportunities for a new luxury headset that they're coming out with next year or this year. But they were trying to partner with A24 and another studio to bring, and I was like, oh wait, we could go live in the A24 universe, in the metaverse, in Meta Land.
Me and Zendaya, dude, me and fucking Ari Aster.
I'm there with Honora.
Oh my god, we got the little ethnic woman from Honora in there, up in that bitch. Oh my god, that'd be so sick. Yeah, live in a 1-bedroom apartment in the
idea
A24.
Of having like an A24 Marvel universe in the Meta headset. It's like, yeah, that is actually where we're headed.
Zoomer slop.
Fucking fuck everybody.
Is there it's A24, what's the other one? Isn't there another one like that too? That's like with a cool company or whatever. A24, I'm A24 Graza. That's what I'm naming my kid.
Little A24 X Graza squeezy bottle, but it's for formula.
All right, let's wrap this up. My name is Brace.
I'm Liz.
I'm producer Young Chomsky.
And this is TrueAnon. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein.